Imagine, just for a second, that you could time travel.
Okay, I'm with you.
So you go back to this prestigious university in the year 1650, right? You find a medical doctor and you ask them to explain the biological differences between men and women.
And you'd probably expect them to pull out a chart showing two, entirely different biological structures.
Exactly, but they wouldn't point to two different sexes. I mean, they would actually point to one.
Which is wild to think about today.
Right. For nearly 2,000 years, Western science largely operated on this belief that women were just biologically inverted men. Like, we were all on one single continuous spectrum of human embodiment.
A literal sliding scale of humanity.
Yeah. So, okay, let's unpack this. When did we suddenly decide that there were two rigidly distinct opposite sexes? And, more importantly, whose political agenda did that brand new science actually serve?
That is exactly the kind of historical whiplash that forces us to completely reevaluate the ground we walk on. I mean, we assume that the bedrock of our reality, our biology, our legal systems, our economic models, is just an objective, natural fact.
It's just the way things are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when you look closer, you realize that bedrock was poured by very specific architects at very specific times to, well, enclose very specific groups of people.
And that brings us to today's mission. Welcome to a new deep dive. We are so thrilled that you, our fellow lifelong learner, are joining us today because we are taking on a truly monumental text.
We really are. We're looking at the Oxford Handbook of Feminist Theory, edited by Lisa Dish and Mary Hawksworth.
And I want to set the stage right now. If you think a book on feminist theory is just like a niche look at quote-unquote women's issues, prepare to have your entire framework shifted.
Oh, absolutely.
This is a profound, exhaustive exploration of how feminist scholarship transforms our understanding of power, of modern science, capitalism, and honestly, of reality itself.
Yeah. In the social sciences, this text acts as an obligatory point of passage. Whether your field is macroeconomics, molecular biology, or even data science, the frameworks presented here challenge what philosophers traditionally call the view from nowhere.
The view from nowhere, meaning like pure objectivity.
Right, that enduring myth that pure, unbiased, disembodied objectivity is somehow achievable. What the scholars in this volume demonstrate methodically is that knowledge is always situated. It always comes from somewhere.
That's a perspective.
Exactly. And we are stepping into some heavily debated, deeply complex territory today. We're going to be mapping out everything from Marxist critiques of global capitalism to, debates over neoliberalism and the strict governance of human reproduction.
Right. And as your guides on this journey, I want to make it super clear that our job isn't to tell you what to believe. We aren't here to endorse any specific political ideology, left or right.
No, not at all. Our goal is neutral exploration.
We just want to unpack the mechanics of these theories. We want to open up the hood on these concepts so you can see exactly how these scholars are reshaping the global conversation. So let's start with where this knowledge actually comes from.
That's a great starting point.
Because it is so easy to fall into the trap of assuming that feminist thought is a recent Western invention, like it just sprang up in a coffee shop in the 1960s.
Right, the classic misconception.
But the editors immediately dismantle that assumption by highlighting these incredibly deep historical roots.
They do. And the geographical and temporal breadth is, well, it's crucial for understanding the true scope of the theory. The introduction pulls us all the way back to the ancient world.
Yeah, I was shocked by this.
For instance, they examine the work of Isara of Lucania. She was a Pythagorean philosopher who lived somewhere around the 4th or 3rd century BCE.
Which is astonishing in itself, just to think about a woman in antiquity actively shaping philosophical discourse. How did she approach her work?
Well, Isara was actively formulating theories of moral development and justice. And she was doing it by observing the actual daily lives of women, men, and children in the home.
So she was looking at the household.
Yes. She viewed justice in both the home and the broader the city-state through the philosophical lens of harmonia, or harmony. She wasn't just accepting the dominant patriarchal models of her time.
Right, she was connecting the dots.
Exactly. She was suggesting that the micro-level dynamics of the household were fundamentally linked to the macro-level justice of society. I mean, she was doing structural analysis thousands of years ago.
And it wasn't just happening in the Mediterranean either. The text completely shatters the Western-centric timeline by introducing us to Su Wulan, a female prodigy from 4th century China.
Oh, her work is fascinating.
The artifact she created, the Swanji 2, or the armillary sphere diagram, is just mind-bending. It's a palindromic poem made up of a grid of 29 by 29 characters.
Yes, and the complexity of that grid is hard to overstate. In traditional Western philosophy, there's this heavy reliance on what we call logocentrism.
Logocentrism. Okay, break that down for us.
It's the idea that truth is found in a strict, linear, spoken word first kind of logic. You read from left to right, beginning to end, and there is one singular authoritative meaning.
Like reading a standard textbook.
Right. But Su Rulan's diagram completely subverts that linear authority. You can read it backward, forward, horizontally, vertically, diagonally, even in concentric circles.
It generates almost 8,000 different poems, depending on how you navigate it. I mean, that is just wild.
It really is. It's spatial, it's multidirectional, and it completely refuses to be locked into a single dominant interpretation.
So, highlighting thinkers like Esera and Surulan isn't just about providing neat historical trivia, then.
No, not at all. It serves a very specific theoretical purpose for the editors. It fundamentally challenges the way we have been taught to categorize feminist history.
You mean the waves model, because that is how I originally learned it in school.
Most of us did.
You know, first wave was the suffragettes, second wave was the 1960s women's liberation, third wave was the 90s riot girls, and so on. It feels like a neat and tidy way to organize history. Why do the editors take issue with that?
Because that neatness comes at a massive cost. The wave metaphor implies a linear progression that centers almost exclusively on white, middle-class, Western women.
Ah, I see.
It treats the periods between those waves as dead zones, where no intellectual work was happening. And that essentially erases the continuous labor of women of color and women in the global South.
It makes it look like they were just sitting around waiting for the next wave to hit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The editors also fiercely critique what they call the hyphenation model.
Okay, the hyphenation model, like when people say Marxist feminism or liberal feminism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
On the surface, it seems like a helpful categorization tool, but implicitly, it treats feminist theory as a secondary derivative offshoot of what the philosopher Mary Daly famously termed mainstream thought.
Mainstream thought, that's a great term. So if you call it Marxist feminism, you are essentially saying that Marxism is the main house and feminism is just like a guest house built in the backyard.
That is exactly the dynamic it creates. It frames the foundational heavy lifting theory as inherently male, and the feminist component as merely an add-on or a specific application.
Right, it minimizes it.
It obscures the fact that feminist thinkers have generated entirely original ontological and epistemological frameworks. It forces their insights into pre-existing Western lineages, implying a trajectory of progress that completely ignores how different cultures conceptualize gender and power.
So if you can't organize the book chronologically without falling into the waves trap, and you can't organize it by schools of thought without falling into the hyphenation trap, how do you structure an entire handbook of theory?
It's a real puzzle.
And this brings us to a structural choice that I found completely brilliant. The book is organized alphabetically. It literally goes from the chapter on affect all the way down to violence.
It's a radical departure from standard academic texts. And that alphabetical ordering is a deeply deliberate intellectual strategy.
How so?
The editors explicitly explain that imposing a thematic organization would end up replicating entrenched, often androcentric presuppositions.
What do you mean by androcentric presuppositions in an index? I mean, how can an index be biased?
Think about how a typical textbook on human society is structured. You almost always start with a section on nature or biology. Then later in the book, you move on to chapters about society or politics.
Right, because we assume you have to build the biological human first before you can put them in a society.
Exactly. But by doing that, the textbook is implicitly endorsing a massive philosophical assumption. It's endorsing the idea that biology is the ultimate foundational truth and that society is just an artificial layer painted on top of it.
So it reinforces biological determinism.
Yes, but when you organize a book alphabetically, you end up putting a concept like agency right next to biopolitics. You put nature directly adjacent to norms.
It is like shuffling a deck of cards so you can't predict the game being played. The alphabetical index isn't just a filing system, it's a rebellion against the filing system.
That's a perfect way to put it.
You are forcing the reader to look at biology and social norms on completely equal footing, without assuming that one automatically gave birth to the other.
It forces you to build entirely new connections without relying on the tired maps of reality we usually use. It stops the reader from falling into the trap of assuming the individual naturally precedes the social.
And speaking of not assuming that biology is the ultimate unchangeable foundation, that transitions us perfectly back to the medical doctor from the year 1650.
Yes, the one-sex model.
Right. If the alphabetical structure stops us from assuming biology dictates society, we really need to look at how we view the human body itself. Because we assume the biological male and female binary is the absolute bedrock, right?
It's the assumption most of us are raised with.
But the text completely pulls the rug out from under that idea.
It does.
Hmm.
And to understand how radical this is, we have to look at the historical research of Thomas Laqueur, which the handbook draws upon to make a crucial point about the physical body.
Okay, tell me more about Laqueur's research.
As you mentioned at the start of our deep dive, up until the Enlightenment, Western medical science largely operated on a one-sex continuum.
I really need to understand the mechanics of this. How did they possibly look at male and female bodies and see only one sex?
It comes down to how they understood the nature of perfection and vital heat.
Vital heat.
Yeah, for nearly 2 millennia, heavily influenced by Galenic medicine, the dominant European model did not view men and women as completely incommensurate opposite creatures.
Okay.
Instead, the male body was considered the paradigm of perfection because it supposedly possessed the most vital heat.
Hmm.
Women were viewed essentially as colder, less perfect variations of that single human form.
Wait, really? So they thought the internal anatomy was the same?
Yes. Their reproductive organs were thought to be structurally the exact same as a man's, just internal rather than external. And the logic was that their bodies lacked the vital heat to push those organs outward.
Wow. So it was certainly a hierarchy. Men were still viewed as superior, but it was a hierarchy on a single sliding scale of embodiment. Women were basically just undercooked men.
Precisely. They were not a different species. They were just at a different point on the same continuum.
So what changed? When did the scientific community suddenly flip the switch and decide that we are actually two completely distinct opposite biological sexes?
The two-sex model of absolute biological dimorphism was constructed in the 18th century. And the timing of the scientific quote-unquote discovery is the key to everything.
Timing is everything, right?
This new model emerged exactly as the Enlightenment philosophers and Republican revolutionaries across Europe and America were declaring an entirely new political paradigm.
Which was what?
They were declaring universal rights, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal.
Oh, I see the massive problem they suddenly had.
Right.
If you just declared that all humans are fundamentally equal and deserve the right to self-governance, and your science says that women are on the exact same human continuum as men, well, why don't women get the right to vote? Why don't they get to own property or hold office?
Exactly. The purportedly universal rights of the Enlightenment deeply threatened the traditional patriarchal order.
I bet it did.
If everyone is on a continuum, the justification for subjugating half the population suddenly evaporates. So, proponents of natural philosophy and medicine proposed a new framework.
A convenient new framework.
Very convenient. They suggested that human biology should actually be understood as a fixed oppositeness. Men and women weren't on a continuum. They were fundamentally, physically, and essentially different in every conceivable way.
They mobilized biology to solve a political crisis.
They did. They lodged the markers of political difference deep inside the physical body to prove that women were naturally, biologically incapable of participating in the rational public sphere.
That is just incredible.
The biological binary was constructed to justify political exclusion precisely at the moment when political inclusion was becoming the global ideal.
That is staggering. We always think of biology as the immutable hardware and society as the software that we just install onto it. But this text argues that society actually designed the hardware specs to fit its own political operating system.
And this realization leads directly to the groundbreaking work of Anne Oakley in 1972, which is heavily featured in the handbook.
What did Oakley argue?
Oakley radicalized the concept of gender. She was one of the first to clearly articulate the separation between biological sex and the learned social roles of gender.
So pulling apart the hardware and the software.
Exactly. She argued that a sense of belonging to the feminine or the masculine is not an automatic biological given. It is the result of intense, lifelong social indoctrination.
So if gender is a social construct layered over a politically motivated biological binary, then the physical body isn't just a vessel, it becomes a heavily contested jurisdiction.
It becomes political territory.
Right. And that brings us to Carol H. Browner's chapter on reproduction. She quotes Margaret Sanger, who famously stated, "No woman can call herself free who does not own and control her body." Browner breaks down how reproduction is never just a private biological event.
No, it is perhaps the most heavily governed aspect of human life. Browner's chapter details how the state continuously attempts to manage reproduction.
Like how?
From dictating policies on contraception and abortion to the complex legal engineering of fetal personhood.
The idea of fetal personhood is fascinating in this context because it literally turns the womb into a battleground for state control. The state steps in and says, we have a vested interest in what happens inside this physical space.
Because controlling the reproduction of the population is essential for maintaining the state's economic and political power. But, I imagine you might have a lingering question about the hardware-software analogy we used earlier regarding the biological binary.
I do, actually. I want to push back a bit, just to play devil's advocate for the listener.
Go for it.
Even if we accept that the 18th century invented the two-sex model for political reasons to keep women out of voting booths, doesn't modern empirical science prove that they were technically right? Isn't biological dimorphism like XX and XY chromosomes just a hard, undeniable scientific fact?
That is a very common assumption, and it's exactly why Develina Roy's chapter on science studies is so essential in this handbook.
Yeah.
Because she demonstrates how science still constructs dimorphism where there is actually a continuum.
Okay, how does she prove that?
She cites the profound findings of researchers Suzanne Kessler and Wendy McKenna. They looked across the entire spectrum of biological markers, chromosomes, hormones, gonads, internal morphology, external genitalia.
And what did they find? Do the markers line up into two neat columns?
No, they do not.
Yeah.
None of these correlates of biological sex perfectly conform to a strict dichotomous classification.
Really? None of them?
None of them. For instance, there are individuals with XY chromosomes who possess a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Their bodies process androgens differently, and they develop external genitalia that appear female.
Wow, okay.
There are people with XXY chromosomes. There are myriad intersex variations where hormonal levels and internal organs just do not align with our rigid definitions of male and female.
So nature is constantly producing variety. It is producing a continuum.
Yes. Kessler and McKenna argue something incredibly profound. It is our social conviction that there must be only two genders that leads to the scientific discovery of rigid biological differences.
So we see what we want to see.
Exactly. We look at the continuum of human biology, we filter out all the variations that don't fit the binary, we label those variations as disorders or anomalies, and then we declare that the binary is a perfect law of nature. The social belief precedes the scientific fact.
Wow. We literally force the data to fit the hypothesis.
We really do.
But this raises a massive logistical question for me. If science itself, when looked at objectively, is showing us a continuum, how do our institutions keep enforcing the binary? How does this illusion maintain such an iron grip on literally every aspect of our daily lives, from public bathrooms to medical research?
To understand how the binary is so effectively enforced, we have to completely reevaluate our definition of power.
Okay, reevaluate it how?
It is not enforced by a single dictator making decrees. It's enforced microphysically. And Johanna Oksala's chapter in the handbook explores this beautifully.
I was really struck by how early feminists visualized this power dynamic. Oksala notes that in the 17th and 18th centuries, writers like Mary Estelle and Mary Wollstonecraft looked at the institution of marriage, and they didn't mince words.
No, they were incredibly direct.
They literally used the legal framework of slavery to describe it. Estelle famously asked, if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves?
And we have to understand that they weren't just being dramatically poetic.
Right, it was literal.
Under the coverture laws of that era, the legal and civil position of a wife fundamentally resembled that of a slave. Upon marriage, a woman's legal existence was suspended.
She just legally vanished?
Yes. She could not own property, she could not sign contracts, and her husband was legally permitted and often encouraged to physically punish her to maintain order. The power dynamic was top-down, explicit, and backed by the brutal force of the state.
But as society evolved and those explicit laws were slowly rolled back, feminist theory had to evolve too, because the oppression didn't disappear when women got the right to vote or own property.
The power just shifted.
It mutated. And this is where Celeste Montoya's chapter on institutions is so critical. We often think of institutions as big brick-and-mortar buildings. We think of the Supreme Court, the hospital, the university.
The traditional structural view of institutions. But feminist scholars radically broaden this definition. Montoya explains that institutions are much more insidious than buildings.
They are the rules.
Yes, institutions are the pervasive, formal, and informal rules that structure human behavior. They are the invisible architecture of our daily routines.
Okay, let's play with a metaphor here to make this concrete for you listening. It is less like fighting a king who lives in a castle, and more like trying to change the rules of Monopoly while everyone is already sitting at the table playing it.
Oh, I love that analogy.
The power isn't held by the person acting as the banker. The power is in the fact that we all just implicitly agree on what the dice mean and what happens when you land on boardwalk.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It is not just the formal law that says women cannot be CEOs. It is the informal, unspoken rule that says women are naturally better at taking notes in the meeting, or women are naturally more nurturing, so they should handle the office birthdays.
And those little things add up.
They do. Those micro rules aggregate into massive disparities in wealth and power over time.
And Oksala details how this theoretical shift in understanding rules was heavily influenced by the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. How does Foucault change the feminist understanding of power?
Foucault moved the analysis of power away from two dominant models. First, he rejected the literal view, which treats power as a tangible resource you can possess, like a bag of gold or a voting ballot.
Right, like something you can hand over to someone else.
Exactly. Second, he challenged the strict Marxist view, which sees power primarily as a blunt instrument of class struggle. Instead, Foucault introduced the concept of disciplinary power.
Disciplinary power, how does that operate?
Disciplinary power is an invisible, diffuse force. It does not operate by chopping off heads. It operates through constant surveillance, normalization, and the optimization of bodies.
Normalization, meaning making people act normal.
Yes. It works by establishing a norm and then constantly measuring everyone against that norm. It functions in the layout of a school desk designed to keep children looking forward, in the strict schedule of a hospital ward, and today, in the algorithms on our social media feeds that reward certain aesthetic performances of gender.
So power isn't a weapon wielded by a bad guy. It is a current that we are all swimming in.
Exactly. And because disciplinary power is microphysical, it targets the smallest, most mundane details of our daily routines. Mary Beth Mills's chapter on the gender divisions of labor illustrates this with devastating clarity.
How so?
She looks at the division between paid, productive labor in the public sphere and unpaid, reproductive labor in the private sphere. And she shows that this division is one of the most massive mechanisms of disciplinary power in human history.
Reproductive labor meaning like cooking, cleaning, raising children, caring for the elderly.
Yes, capitalism essentially harnesses the unpaid domestic and care work of women to reproduce and maintain the waged labor force.
Because the worker needs to eat and sleep.
Right.
A factory worker can only show up to the factory for 10 hours a day because someone else is at home feeding him, washing his clothes, and raising the next generation of workers for free.
So the power dynamic isn't just in the boardroom where the CEO sets the wages.
It is in the kitchen. It is in the laundry room. It is in the mental load of organizing a household.
Modern sociologists call it the second shift. You work a full day at the office, and then you come home to a second, entirely unpaid shift of domestic management.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to stop and ask a practical question here.
Mhm.
If power is everywhere, if it's microphysical, if it's in our habits, in our homes, in the way my partner and I divide up the dishwashing, isn't it effectively nowhere?
That is the big question.
Like, how do you fight an invisible architecture? If I am oppressed by informal rules and my own internalized habits, how do I possibly rewrite them?
That is the central, agonizing dilemma of navigating disciplinary power. You cannot just overthrow a king to fix it. You can't just pass a single law.
So what's the solution? Foucault argued that wherever there is power, there is resistance. But that resistance must also be microphysical. It involves actively questioning the very norms that we have internalized as natural.
You have to start noticing the rules of monopoly.
Yes. It requires looking at the world from completely different vantage points to expose those invisible rules.
Which is the perfect conceptual transition to how we actually do that. If power is a fog of informal rules, how do we see clearly through it?
We need new lenses.
Right. We have to change our lenses. And the handbook provides two of the most powerful lenses ever developed, standpoint theory and intersectionality. Let's unpack Kristen Intiman's chapter on feminist standpoint theory.
Standpoint theory is a profound epistemological intervention. It asks, who is allowed to create knowledge, and how does their social position affect what they can know?
Okay.
Intiman outlines 5 key tenets, but the entire framework really hinges on 2 massive paradigm shifts: the situated knowledge thesis and the epistemic advantage thesis.
Okay, let's break those down. What is the situated knowledge thesis?
The situated knowledge thesis argues that your social position dictates what you are capable of knowing.
Because we all live different lives.
Exactly. Because systems of oppression like racism, sexism, and classism materially influence our circumstances and how society treats us. People in different social locations have fundamentally different experiences.
That makes sense.
Therefore, knowledge is never a universal view from nowhere. It is always situated in a specific lived reality. A billionaire and an unhoused person do not possess the same knowledge about how the justice system operates because the system treats them differently.
That makes intuitive sense, but then it pushes further into the epistemic advantage thesis, which completely flips traditional academia on its head.
It really does.
It argues that marginalized groups might actually have a more objective, more accurate view of power structures because they are forced to navigate them just to survive.
Exactly. Let's use an analogy to make this clear. Imagine a massive, complex factory. The CEO sits in a sterilized corner office on the top floor looking at spreadsheets and profit margins.
Right, and the CEO thinks they know exactly how the factory runs because they built the corporate structure.
But the CEO has the privilege of ignorance. They don't know that machine number 4 constantly jams, or that the safety rails on the second floor are loose. The person sweeping the factory floor, however, knows every single crack in the concrete.
They see it all?
Yes. The floor sweeper does not have the luxury of ignoring the CEO's rules, but they also see how those rules fail in practice. Therefore, the marginalized perspective yields a much more comprehensive, objective map of how the factory or society actually operates.
The people at the bottom have to understand the people at the top just to survive, but the people at the top never have to understand the people at the bottom.
Precisely.
So standpoint theory tells us where to look for truth. Look to the margins. But intersectionality tells us how to look at those margins. And Brittany Cooper's chapter does an incredible job of tracing the roots of this.
It does. Cooper traces intersectionality back to the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and even further back into the rich tradition of Black feminist thought, specifically the Combahee River Collective in 1977.
The Combahee River Collective statement is such a foundational document. They were a group of Black, lesbian, socialist feminists who essentially said the mainstream feminist movement is only focusing on gender and the civil rights movement is primarily focusing on race, but we are experiencing both simultaneously.
Precisely. Intersectionality is the fundamental insight that systems of oppression, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy are not separate, parallel lanes on a highway.
They aren't isolated.
No, they are constantly interacting, co-constituting, and reinforcing each other. They are the intersection where the crash happens. You cannot extract gender from a Black woman and study it in a vacuum, because her gender is always racialized and her race is always gendered.
It insists that power is encoded within particular specific bodies, but there is a really intense academic debate happening within the handbook about how intersectionality is currently being utilized in the modern corporate and academic world.
Yes, this is a crucial debate.
Nicole Alexander Floyd offers a really sharp critique of another scholar, Ange Marie Hancock. What's the core of that disagreement?
This is vital for anyone interested in how radical ideas get absorbed by the mainstream. Hancock had argued for turning intersectionality into a general universal research paradigm.
Meaning anyone could use it for anything.
Basically, she wanted to make it a broad methodology for studying any multiple variables of identity.
Which sounds like a good thing, right? Expanding the tool so everyone can use it. Why does Alexander Floyd push back on that?
Alexander Floyd accuses this universalizing approach of committing a bait and switch. She warns that when you strip intersectionality of its specific radical political purpose, when it just becomes a generic tool to study how everyone is a unique mix of different things, you erase the specific knowledge production and the unique lived realities of Black women.
Because Black women forged the concept to describe their specific subjugation under interlocking lethal systems of power.
Exactly.
If a corporate HR department uses intersectionality just to mean we have a diverse staff with different hobbies and backgrounds, it completely blunts the weapon.
It depoliticizes a profoundly political framework. It turns a tool meant to dismantle racialized gender depression into a corporate buzzword that just manages diversity without challenging the actual structure of the company.
And this tension between discovering a radical truth about how power works and then watching systems of power try to absorb and neutralize that truth is something we see accelerating as technology advances.
Without a doubt.
Which brings us to the bleeding edge of the handbook. We are moving into some incredibly dense vanguard territory here. Affect, trans identities, and post-humanism. We've talked about how institutions control our actions through rules. But what if they control us before we even consciously decide to act?
That is the terrifying and fascinating premise of the effective turn in social theory, which Marianne Liljeström explores in her chapter. To grasp this, we have to completely separate two words that we usually use interchangeably in our daily lives: emotion and affect.
Right. This took me a minute to wrap my head around. So an emotion is a conscious narrative feeling. It is me saying, I am angry at my boss because they passed me over for a promotion. It has a subject, an object, and a story attached to it.
Yes, emotion is biographical. It is how you make sense of a feeling after the fact. Affect, on the other hand, is entirely different. It is defined as a precognitive bodily intensity or force. It operates below the threshold of conscious thought.
Like when you walk into a room where two people were just arguing, and before anyone says a word, your heart rate spikes and the hair on your arm stands up.
Perfect example.
You don't have a story for it yet, but your body is reacting to the intense energy in the room.
Exactly. Affect is the active presence of the body in connection to the intensities of the present moment. It is the physiological rush, the contagious energy. And there is a massive academic clash in the handbook over how to interpret the political implications of affect.
Who are the main players in that clash?
On one side, you have theorists like Brian Masumi.
How does Masumi view it?
Masumi views affect as an autonomous, limitless, virtual field of excess. He argues that it operates entirely outside of conscious perception or language. For him, it is pure, unbound intensity that cannot be easily captured by social norms.
So it is kind of a wild, free-flowing electricity that defies categorization.
That's his view.
But then Sarah Ahmed steps in and says, not so fast.
Sarah Ahmed is a brilliant theorist of emotion and affect. She argues that Masumi's view severely underdescribes how power actually works. Ahmed argues that affect is not some free-floating autonomous energy. Affect is sticky.
Sticky affect. What does that look like in practice?
It means that affects like fear, disgust, or joy become deeply tied to specific bodies and specific objects through repeated social narratives.
Like guilt by association, almost.
Think about how certain marginalized bodies become associated with danger in the public imagination, while other bodies are associated with innocence. Ahmed warns against viewing affect as a purely biological force detached from the social world, because that risks ignoring how affects are constantly controlled, directed, and mobilized by political power structures to justify things like border walls or policing.
We are taught to literally feel fear before we even process why.
Precisely.
And Patricia Cliff takes this to an even more dystopian level with her concept of the biomediated body, because she looks at how modern capitalism and surveillance are hijacking this exact mechanism.
Clough is looking at the era of neoliberal biopolitics, to put that in concrete terms.
Yeah.
Think about the technology we interact with every day. Smartwatches that track our heart rates, algorithms on our phones that track how many milliseconds our eyes linger on an advertisement, DNA testing, neural imaging.
They aren't just policing our conscious thoughts or what we post online. They are tracking our precognitive biological responses.
Exactly. Clough argues that advanced capitalism has shifted its focus. It doesn't just want to control your labor. It aims at a never-ending modulation of your moods, your capacities, and your biological potentialities. You are assembled into a body of data.
That is terrifying.
If an algorithm knows exactly what specific image will trigger a microspike in your cortisol levels, it can mobilize your affect to keep you scrolling or keep you buying before you even realize you are anxious.
It reduces our bodies to an informational substrate. So if affect operates below our conscious thought and our very nervous systems are being modulated by algorithms and biometric surveillance, how do we possibly politically organize around it?
It's the huge problem.
Are we just at the absolute mercy of the digital architecture of capitalism?
That is the existential question of 21st century agency. How do you resist a power that operates before you even formulate a conscious thought of resistance? This is why feminist science studies and posthumanism are so vital right now.
Right, posthumanism.
Rosie Braidotti's chapter tackles this head-on. She argues that we can no longer rely on the traditional Enlightenment ideal of the human to save us.
Because historically, when philosophers talked about universal human rights, the universal human almost always implicitly meant a white, male, European property owner.
Yes, the humanist ideal was an exclusionary category from the start. Bravotti pushes us toward posthumanism. She argues that we must understand ourselves not as isolated, rational masters of the universe, but as deeply entangled beings.
Entangled with what?
We are cyborgs intertwined with our technology. We are biological entities inextricably linked to a degrading ecology. We have to build political coalitions based on those entanglements, rather than retreating into the old illusion of the independent, rational man.
And speaking of bodies that inherently disrupt that traditional, rigid, humanist ideal, we have to look at Talia May Betcher's chapter on trans and intersex experiences.
It's a crucial chapter.
Because she makes a critical point about how feminism needs to engage with these communities. She argues they are not just topics for feminism to study under a microscope.
That is a vital distinction.
Yeah.
Betcher argues that trans and intersex identities are distinct political locations. Centering these experiences does not just add a new chapter to feminist theory, it fundamentally alters the entire framework.
How does it alter it?
It reveals forms of sex and gender-based oppression that are simply not reducible to standard binary sexism.
It exposes the violent enforcement of the borders we talked about at the very beginning.
Exactly. Trans and intersex bodies expose the fact that the 18th century two-sex model is not a natural given, but a heavily policed border. The hostility and violence directed at trans and intersex individuals serve as an enforcement mechanism for the entire patriarchal structure.
It's society lashing out.
It is society desperately trying to maintain the illusion of the binary.
Because if the binary collapses, the justification for the unequal distribution of power collapses with it. It all connects beautifully.
It really does.
So we're faced with this massive, interconnected system. From 18th century medical diagrams to informal rules in the kitchen to algorithms tracking our heart rates. How do we rewrite the code?
We have to change the narrative.
And that brings us to our final leg of the journey. Storytelling, religion, and the personal as political.
The phrase, "the personal is political," is arguably feminism's most famous and, well, misunderstood maxim. It doesn't just mean your personal choices are important. Renee Heberle's chapter contextualizes the deep methodology behind it with a stunning historical comparison.
This part of the handbook was riveting. She compares the feminist consciousness-raising groups of the 1970s where women gathered in living rooms to share their private, personal experiences of subjugation to the 1949 Chinese Communist Party's Speak Bitterness campaigns.
Yes. To understand the power of this, you have to look at how the Speak Bitterness campaigns functioned. During the Revolutionary War in China, party organizers went into rural villages and encouraged peasants to publicly witness against the landlords who had abused them for generations.
They stood up in front of the community and detailed the beatings, the theft, the starvation.
Yes, and these sessions of public witnessing were a profound political technology. They were a way to convert isolated individual suffering into a unified collective political grievance. And it led directly to a revolutionary taking of the means of production. The peasants reclaimed the land.
Wow.
Haberle makes the brilliant point that feminist consciousness raising was deploying the exact same mechanism.
Women were taking their isolated private pain, the domestic violence, the crushing weight of unpaid labor, the workplace harassment that they thought was just their own personal failure, and they were speaking it into the public sphere.
By speaking bitterness, they transformed the isolated victim into a collective political subject. They seized the means of production of their own identities. They realized that their individual problems were actually structural realities.
But as feminists sought to rewrite these narratives and change the structures, they ran into massive, ancient roadblocks that are incredibly hard to dismantle. Which brings us to Lisbeth Mickelson's chapter on religion.
Michael Kazin explores the grand theory regarding major world religions. The theory posits that major religious institutions have historically functioned to mystify male power as a divine arrangement.
It is the ultimate trump card. I mean, it is one thing to argue with a politician about a law or argue with a scientist about a biological diagram. It is quite another to argue with God.
Exactly.
By framing patriarchal rule, the idea that men are the natural head of the household and the church as God-given, it places the oppression entirely beyond critique. It naturalizes human power dynamics with sublime authority.
And attempting to untangle that divine mystification brings us to a profound philosophical and legal bind, which is deeply explored in Lisa Dish's chapter on representation. It is known as the dilemma of difference, or Minnow's dilemma, named after legal scholar Martha Minnow.
This dilemma is the ultimate legal catch-22 for any marginalized group. How does it work?
Imagine you are trying to write legal policy to achieve equality. If you choose to ignore the differences between groups, if you say the law is colorblind and genderblind, everyone is treated exactly the same. You end up perpetuating systems that were built exclusively for the dominant group.
Right, because treating a pregnant worker exactly the same as a non-pregnant worker means the pregnant worker might get fired when they need to give both.
Exactly. So you try the other route. You decide to highlight the differences and legislate based on them. You create special protections or categories. But when you do that, you risk reinforcing the very negative stereotypes that caused the oppression in the first place.
You trap them again.
Yes. You risk legally cementing the idea that women are fundamentally weaker or require special paternalistic care from the state.
How do you demand rights for a specific group without simultaneously reinforcing the idea that they are essentially different in a way that justifies treating them differently down the line? How do you rewrite the narrative when the legal grammar itself is biased?
It is a staggering challenge. But this is where the theorist Judith Butler offers a glimmer of structural hope with her concept of performativity.
How does performativity help us escape the catch-22?
Butler teaches us that gender and the power associated with it is not an internal biological truth. It is a matrix of repeated practices. It is a performance.
We act it out.
Yes, we do gender through the clothes we wear, the way we walk, the jobs we take. But because it is a performance, it requires constant, unending repetition to maintain the illusion of substance.
Like constantly reapplying a coat of paint so the rust doesn't show?
Precisely. And because it requires constant repetition by millions of people every day, there's always room for a slip in the performance. There's always room for variation, for parody, for subversion.
We can change the script.
The grammar of our institutions may be biased, but the way we speak that grammar can change. The very act of speaking bitterness, of sharing a personal grievance, of refusing the script, is how we start to seize the narrative.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have traveled through thousands of years of history and dense philosophical frameworks. Let's recap this incredible journey.
Let's do it.
We started by completely demolishing the myth of the biological binary, learning how the 18th century scientific establishment literally invented the two-sex model to hoard political power during the Enlightenment.
Right, and then we redefined our understanding of institutions. We realized they are not just physical buildings, but the invisible, microphysical rules that govern our daily habits and mandate the unpaid reproductive labor that props up global capitalism.
We explored how feminist standpoint theory and intersectionality demand that we completely change our vantage point. We have to look at the world from the margins out, recognizing that the floor sweeper has a much clearer view of the factory's machinery than the CEO in the corner office.
We ventured into the vanguard of theory, looking at how affect, biometric surveillance, and posthumanism are challenging the very definition of what it means to be human. We saw how power doesn't just limit our choices. It actively modulates our precognitive bodies.
And we ended with the profound, enduring power of storytelling. How speaking bitterness and exposing the divine mystification of patriarchy is the very first crucial step to untangling the dilemma of difference.
If there is an ultimate takeaway from this exhaustive handbook for you listening, it's this. Feminist theory is not a niche subfield relegated to a single university department. It is a vital, indispensable, critical lens for understanding reality.
You needed to see clearly.
Absolutely. Without it, our understanding of macroeconomics, of scientific inquiry, of legal jurisprudence, and of global governance is fundamentally incomplete. It teaches us the most important structural lesson of all. Difference is never just a neutral fact of nature. It is always a vector of power.
And that leads me to a final provocative thought for you to take with you. If, as this deep dive has shown us, gender is a technology, A system of categorization designed to distribute power on a microphysical, effective level. Think about the world we are building right now.
It's a sobering thought.
Think about artificial intelligence and the algorithms that govern our digital lives. We are currently feeding these machines all of our historical data, all of our language, all of our unexamined biases. Are we unknowingly coding 18th century biological binaries and exclusionary rules directly into the foundation of 22nd century tech?
We might be.
And if so, as those algorithms begin to monitor our heart rates and predict our behaviors, what kind of massive digital speak bitterness campaign will be required to dismantle the algorithmic matrix we are currently building? Something to mull over until next time.